I'm delighted to welcome you to our online keynote for September, Decoding Egyptian Hieroglyphs, the meaning of the Rosetta Stone. So this is our finale in our theme of The Walls Speak, which is presenting the significance of the Rosetta Stone within the broader context of deciphering ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. So I am delighted to introduce Elona Rogolski, who is the curator of the Egyptian written culture at the British Museum, and she is responsible for the papyrus collection and other inscribed material in the collection, including the Rosetta Stone. So her areas of expertise include epigraphy and paleography from the early dynastic period through the New Kingdom, and she is also the director of a research project investigating the deep history of the Asyut region, which includes community archaeology and heritage communication. So thank you so much for this presentation today. I know all of our audience are very keen to hear your talk, and we will leave you to it. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. It's raining here too, so very happy to be inside. And thank you to the ES for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to do anything with the ES, and I'm very happy to talk to you today about the Rosetta Stone and a little bit about, of course, the decipherment, which we're celebrating this year, and yeah, talking also a little bit about our exhibition that will open on the 13th of October. I'm going to share my screen and hope that you can all see this.
Looks great. Thank you, Elona.
Yeah. So yeah, if there's any moment that you can't hear me, please let me know, wave or something, because I can't see all of you. But yeah, so hopefully you can see my screen. Well, so what I thought to do tonight was to, of course, as the title of my lecture said, and also the subtitle, which is not included on the slide, said, is I would like to talk a bit more about the Rosetta Stone in the context of the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs, and thereby also starting a little bit earlier, leading up to the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, in order to really bring the message across why this discovery was so important, and then what it meant for the decipherment. Because of time, I will not be able to talk about the decipherment itself so much. I'll see where I get towards the end, but I really would like to focus on that pre-1799 engagement with hieroglyphs and the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, but even more also talking about the object itself, because we always talk about the Rosetta Stone in the context of decipherment, but we rarely talk about what actually is written on it, and what does it say about Egypt at the time in the 3rd and the 2nd century BC. So, oops, I hope this works. Egyptian hieroglyphs have always amazed people in trying to reconstruct the history of writing, are one of the most important achievements, in my opinion, in human history. We often turn to sources from ancient Egypt, and because every aspect of Egyptian culture, its religious practice, monumental buildings, bureaucratic details, relied on a system of writing developed around 3250 BC. But the picture-like nature of hieroglyphs, which makes them very beautiful and makes them even small pieces of art, do hide the fact that they represented a spoken language. So they were art, they were iconography, and they were very much used in synergy with art compositions and tombs and temples, but they also represent a spoken language. And this spoken language was used until the 15th century of our time era, making it one of history's longest spoken and recorded languages. So that's quite impressive, of course, living on in present-day Coptic. But following the conquest of Alexander the Great in 332 BC, The ancient scripts, of which you see a few examples here, fell out of use. So on the left, you see two handwritten forms of hieroglyphs, hieratic and demotic. With these slides, I'm also referring to objects that will be visible in our exhibition, as I mentioned, which is Hieroglyphs Unlocking Ancient Egypt, which I hope you will all come to see, opening on the 13th of October. And we want to give the visitor in the introduction immediately the necessary baggage or luggage to start the journey. So on the left, you see the handwritten scripts with hieroglyphs. They fall out of use in Egypt when a new alphabet is used to record the spoken language. This alphabet is a real alphabet based on Greek letters with a few demotic signs. This will develop into Coptic, and this is the script that will live on. So that relationship between script and language is lost at some point, and especially if when the language is displaced by Greek and later Arabic, the ability to read ancient Egyptian vanished. Greek and Roman authors could not read hieroglyphs anymore, or at least most of them couldn't. They believed that the hieroglyphs were symbols rather than sounds of spoken language, which I will sometimes refer to by phonetic in this lecture. And this was a belief that hieroglyphs were symbols that went unquestioned and effectively obstructed decipherment for centuries. Despite some accurate deductions, which we will survey in the first part of the lecture, Egypt's ancient writings remained largely a mystery until 1799, when the Rosetta Stone provided the vital key. Of course, when we survey this period, we have to start in Egypt itself, where people were surrounded by colorful hieroglyphs that captured their attention and their imagination on tomb walls, temple walls, but also objects that were just sitting around. Like, for example, in this image, the sarcophagus on the left, which is a sarcophagus of Habmen, but it was sitting on the banks of the Nile, not far from where present-day Ibn Tulun Mosque is situated. And I start the exhibition, the core of the exhibition, with this object because it is a very good example of how the Egyptians, sorry, not the ancient Egyptians, but the Egyptians just passed by these objects and started to give their own meaning to these objects, to the hieroglyphs. And in this case, several legends developed around this hieroglyph, around this object. For example, many different legends. The one that I like and the one that we chose to tell in our 55-word label is the one that if you drink from the water in this basin or you bath in it, you would be cured of the torments of love. So the idea was that because they couldn't read hieroglyphs, they thought that there was some magical workings that would be activated if you would drink or bath in the sarcophagus. It was called the Lover's Fountain. It was also called the Enchanted Basin, in Arabic, Al-Hud al-Mahsud. And today, still, this area where this sarcophagus once sat is called Al-Hud al-Mahsud. There is even a bus stop with this name. So I really like this, this story of how these kind of incorrect, but still very meaningful interpretations of hieroglyphs have led to even a neighborhood in Cairo being called like this today. The other medieval Arab travelers, Islamic scholars, Arab scholars, contributed significantly to the earliest ideas about what hieroglyphs were. In their explorations of temples and tombs, which they viewed as laboratories of alchemy, which is a kind of natural philosophy. Many tried to read the mysterious letters of the birds to uncover the secrets of ancient sciences and magic. The letters of the birds is something that lives on, but is really is a term that is established by the earliest Arab scholars in the medieval period, probably because the hieroglyphic writing system has so many birds in it. It's also thanks to Arab medieval scholars that we have the connection with Coptic. They already, of course, there were still yeah, there were people speaking Coptic in the 10th, 11th, 12th century and so on. And they turned to these local residents of Egypt, searching for a way to understand the ancient text. So whenever they would find the text, they would get someone who speaks or who was familiar with Coptic to translate these ancient texts, which of course often didn't work because they were often not Coptic but hieroglyphs or some handwritten form of hieroglyphs. But the idea that perhaps the ancient language lived on in Coptic was an idea that some later scholars, European scholars, would build on, such as Champollion, or would dispute, such as Thomas Young, who had very different ideas about the importance of Coptic. As the Arab language, Arabic gained ascendancy, the Copts were concerned about the survival of their language, and they are going to consciously produce grammars and vocabularies, Coptic Arabic. And this was, of course, an extremely important tool, even for later European scholars who knew Arabic. It was a way to access the ancient language. So already medieval Arab scholars had access to the Coptic language in more than one script and language. Coptic monks, again, were believed to be the keepers of this wisdom of the ancestors and were often consulted. And we have several accounts of that, for example, by Egyptian scholars Al-Idrisi, El-Kashandi, who writes about how the knowledge of Coptic could be linked to or could give the way to understanding ancient Egyptians. And they called hieroglyph the first Coptic language, which is an interesting way of looking at it. They already specified, so these medieval Arab scholars already specified that the first Copts had 22 to 36 letters in their alphabet, and some of them refer to this script as an alphabetic script, which Coptic was, of course, but hieroglyphic is not. This, by the way, is a magical papyrus. It's one of the very, very few alchemical papyri that we have. It's kept in the Bodleian and will also be on display in the exhibition. To say that, sure, a lot of texts, of course, were magical, especially those that were recopied in later periods of times. And connoisseurs of the occult sciences, the Arabs were very attracted to this kind of literature, to the esoteric quality of the Egyptian script and to magical text, and they attached alchemical significance to hieroglyphs, perhaps influenced by the Greeks, who already say that the ancient Egyptians were masters of alchemy. And the Arab scholars also follow Greek writers in believing that the ancient writings concealed treasured knowledge that, when translated, would grant the power to understand everything in nature and to even change, would give you the ability to change the law of nature. One scholar that often is being put forward as having contributed immensely to the decipherment of hieroglyphs is Ibn Wahshiyya, the 10th century Iraqi alchemist again and historian, of whom we very little know, we have to say. It's mainly, his contributions have mainly survived through other scholars, and this is a little bit the problem of really interpreting what he has done. For example, his near contemporary Al-Nadim claims to have seen a manuscript in Ibn Wahshiyya's own handwriting that contained the letters used to get access to the ancient sciences, as he says. In this secondary literature, we also find references to Ibn Wahshiyya referring to several scripts. Apparently, he would have already distinguished between the letters of the Copts, the letters of the alphabet, and the letters of South Arabia or hieroglyphs, depending on the translation. He uses a Greek word for, or sometimes uses a Greek word to refer to ancient or sacred writing, as in fact, the Rosetta Stone does. So this idea that there's several scripts to write the ancient Egyptian language is already being put forward by some of these early scholars. And again, his idea that a known language, namely Coptic, could provide a key to an unknown language became a very important principle on which the later decipherment of the Egyptian script was based. The problem again with Ibn Rashia is the original manuscripts are very rare. I have never seen one. I thought there was one in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, but apparently even that is a copy of an original manuscript. So we are dependent on secondary interpretations of his work. Nonetheless, his work was extremely popular because it was translated in many different languages, even Spanish and so on. So he was considered really the specialist in ancient Egypt or ancient Egyptian language in the 10th and 11th century. It's mainly, I want to stress that again, the idea that Coptic contained the remnant of the ancient Egyptian language and the idea that there's many different scripts to write the ancient Egyptian language. That is, in my opinion, their biggest contribution on which later scholars will build. Arab scholars also looked at classical sources and translated them into Arabic. And one of the most important works that they looked at was the Hermetica, or the dialogues of Hermes Trismegistos, a legendary figure based on the Greek god, the Egyptian god of knowledge and writing, thought. So Hermes is thought, basically, while Trismegistos goes back to an epithet borrowed from the ancient Egyptian title for god, used in the for thought, used in the Ptolemaic period, greatest great god. Often depicted writing, as you can see here, he has a papyrus on his lap. He was believed to be the founder of sciences, including medicine, astronomy, and alchemy, and he was supposedly the inventor of hieroglyphs. On your right, you see a pharaonic statue of the god Thoth, who could also be depicted as an ibis or as a human being with an ibis head. And then on the left, you see a very Greek interpretation of what then becomes Hermes. The teachings of Hermes have been or had been transmitted through the ages in the works of Aristotle and other philosophers, and they were held in very high esteem by Arab scholars. And again, in keeping with the Greek tradition, the Arabs also saw Hermes as the founder of medicine and the inventor of the alphabet, who recorded his wisdom in hieroglyphs on the walls of temples and tombs. And early Islamic scholars also drew parallels between the legends of Hermes and the prophet Idris, both believed to be the first to write. And we also have one manuscript in the exhibition that shows this very clearly. While the literature regarding to Hermes Trismegistos led Arabs astray with regards to the meaning of the ancient texts, their extensive alchemical investigations, of course, led to the foundations of modern chemistry, while yielding other very important discoveries, such as the methods for making glass, ceramic, refining metals, and so on and so forth. So there is an interesting link there. Then interest from Europe comes slightly later, and mainly in the 14th and the 15th century, this intensifies. And of course, they look at the same sources. They look at the classical sources. They perhaps look a little bit more at the Bible. And many of them learned Arabic to also be able to look at the Arabic sources. Champollion, of course, in the first place, was very, very good in Arabic and could access all those sources. They, of course, had a big disadvantage, which is the lack of original sources, or at least not to the same extent or the same number than Egyptian or Arabic travelers to Egypt had. And that lack of sources will remain a problem until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. And actually, even later, Champollion and Thomas Young also struggled to get original sources, because we didn't have museums such as the British Museum or the Louvre or any of these big collections yet. So people were really dependent on very small objects or accounts of travelers that came back to Europe. The catalyst for a renewed interest in hieroglyphs was the discovery in Florence, Italy, of two manuscripts, namely Horapollo's Hieroglyphica in 1419, and again, the dialogues of Hermes Trismegistos, which are rediscovered in Italy in the 15th century. The Hieroglyphica that we show here is the oldest surviving manuscript from Florence, which will also be in the exhibition. I'm very excited about that. And they have been attributed to the 5th century Alexandrian priest Apollo the Younger, and they provide descriptions and symbolic interpretations in Greek of some 189 hieroglyphic signs. It's very dense to read, as you can see from the text, which I was a bit surprised by because I had always looked at translations, which are beautifully laid out. And then you see the original manuscript and it's just one text, one sentence after the other. The interpretations of the hieroglyphs are very, very funny. And some are actually identified correctly, such as the B for kingship and the hare to express the idea of opening. As we know, for those of you who know hieroglyphs, the hare sign, or like the rabbit kind of a sign, starts a sequence of consonants when required to write the word open or the verb to open in ancient Egyptian. But the way it's explained is wrong, essentially. Unfamiliar with the mechanisms of the writing system, Apollo turned to naturalistic explanations, and he says the hare was appropriate to write the word open because this animal always keeps its eyes wide open, and that is kind of typical for the time period that we're looking at, for the 15th century, which is still very much the interpretations are still very much based on that kind of symbolism that hieroglyphs had. Yes, and here's the little hare. By the 14th and 16th century, and we really move into the Renaissance then, Europe had access to a quantity of written material, more and more, related to ancient Egypt. And a very important type of objects that Europeans looked at were obelisks, as you can see on the right side. The Renaissance readers encountered a land of impressive kings who built splendid monuments to honor their gods. And some of these, well, most of the obelisks were, of course, trophies of the Roman conquest of Egypt, and they were brought back by the Romans to Italy. And some were copied, so some obelisks were made in Italy, and some were taken from Egypt. But by the 14th century, many of them had fallen into ruin, and there is an effort instigated not least by the popes to conserve, reconstruct, and re-erect these obelisks on important squares of Italy, and mainly Rome. And so Rome really becomes the bustling center for Egyptology, or Egyptian studies, we should say, during the Renaissance period, because it must have been really impressive. It's the first time that people in Europe can see monumental hieroglyphs being erected. So anyone who had an interest in ancient Egypt will go to Italy to see those monuments. They start to study the inscriptions, but also start to look at, so the Renaissance scholars start to also look at the manuscripts that are slowly arriving in Europe. And all of this progress, again, depends largely on the material available. There's still not that much apart from these few monumental obelisks, small quantities of artifacts imported to Egypt. They increased by the 17th century when we see an interest, or the royal fashion for assembling cabinets of curiosities. This was adopted by well-to-do merchants, clergymen, and travelers. And this accelerated or increased by the 17th century when people started to either indirectly get objects from Egypt, or of course, when the first travelers or when travel to Egypt became more possible, people brought things back, often in their suitcase, as it was done at the time, as it was allowed to a certain extent. And so those small objects often populate private collections that later on merge and are incorporated into the big collections, especially in Italy. If you think about museums like Bologna, Florence, Naples, they're all basically the remnants of these old private collections. Very, very interesting collection history. They were considered curiosities. They could not yet be read. They had these mysterious hieroglyphs on them. And there is, in addition to that, an interest in inaccurately copying inscriptions. That is something that comes in addition. Collectors are not only starting to collect objects, but also copies of inscriptions from Egypt and from objects. And the object in the middle with the big hieroglyphs on it comes from a very interesting collection from the museum, the Thorvaldsen Museum in Copenhagen. And Thorvaldsen was a Danish sculptor who moved to Rome and who's very interested in making copies, or who started to be interested in making copies of hieroglyphs by casts, by squeezes, and he collects this. And Champollion later visits his collection in Rome and says it's a treasure house of documentation. So it's mostly plaster and paper, not that many, almost non-original objects in his collection, but the kind of accuracy that people could reach, or that that scholars were striving to, was really quite amazing. He was encouraged very much by Zoëga, who comes slightly later. I just first want to mention Athanasius Kircher. Most of you will have heard of him. I prefer not to talk about him too much because most of what he done was really fantasy. But it gives me an opportunity to show this beautiful, beautiful object. The most famous Egyptian artifact in Renaissance Europe was the Mensa Isiaca, or the tablet Isis, or the Bambini tablet after its first owner, the Venetian poet and future cardinal Pietro Bembo. This inlaid bronze tablet is covered in Egyptian cult scenes and is centered around Isis. It's kind of like a visual database that triggered fresh studies because they are quite accurate, although modern Egyptologists consider the tablet to be an Egyptianized product of imperial Rome rather than a genuine Egyptian artifact. It's nevertheless quite accurate. Even the hieroglyphs are quite accurate, although the inscriptions themselves are pretty meaningless. But it was by copying, they also tried to, again, this idea of accurately capturing hieroglyphs was something that is as important as collecting objects, in fact. Kircher has his own small museum in Rome, and also collects and is again interested in having manuscripts and in drawings and copies of hieroglyphs. He was a very Catholic scholar and therefore also relied on the prophecies of the Egyptian Hermes Trismegistus, as a basis he uses him as a basis for his attempt to restore and disseminate this precious wisdom. He believed that Hermes Trismegistus, again, had invented hieroglyphs and encrypted the doctrines of the so-called Prisca Theologia, so the single religion, a single religion of remote antiquity, of which all other monotheistic faiths arose. And I say this because it's quite astonishing that by this time, and we are now really towards the end of the 17th century, this idea that hieroglyphs are symbols and capture the secret knowledge of everything is still very, very prevailing, and has not really developed much in any other direction. What Kircher does also say is he does stress the importance of the Coptic language for perhaps understanding the vocabulary, at least of ancient Egyptian, but most of his work is pure fantasy. We move to the very end we move into the 18th century, with Zoëga, as I mentioned before, and he was really the last kind of the most important scholar before that whole group of Champollion and his peers. And had he had the Rosetta Stone, then perhaps he would have been the decipherer of hieroglyphs. He came very close. He also studied Coptic a lot and really encouraged people like Thorvaldsen to make accurate copies of inscriptions, as you can see here. This is an object that is currently in the museum in Naples that comes from the Bordia collection, and that again was available to scholars all over. I don't want to focus too much on what all these individual scholars have contributed, because that would lead us too far. But I did want to mention Zoëga because also Champollion later uses his work and holds him in very high esteem. Zoëga, together with Thorvaldsen, he has he thinks that he did very, very good work, which with Champollion is not the case with many other people. Another famous name that I may just want to drop here is Uckerblad, who studied Coptic with Zoëga and who is perhaps the first to establish an alphabet of Demotic and Coptic. And that will be used very intensively by Champollion and Thomas Young as well. But as you can see, there was a lack, and these scholars like Zoëga are all explicitly mentioning this in their writings. There's not only a lack of sources, but as they're saying, there's a lack of bilingual sources. And they say, if only we would have texts that have the same text in 2 languages, this is really what we need. We would be able to do so much more. And in 1799, this then finally happens with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. Because it has a priestly decree in 3 scripts, 2 languages, and below, the lower part is Greek, and because Greek was known, they at least could understand the content of the middle part, which is Demotic, and the top part, which is written in hieroglyphs. The stone was discovered in Rosetta, or present-day Rashid, on the north coast of Egypt. And the story is well known. It was found in the foundations of a fort, of which I have a very beautiful picture. It was discovered by Napoleon's army, who were strengthening the forts because they were attacked by naval forces, British and Egyptian Ottoman naval forces. And so during the works at this fort, they found the stone reused in the foundations. And it was immediately recognized that it was a very important archaeological object, because immediately it was said, and it was even in the newspapers of Egypt, that this could provide the key to decipherment. It was brought to Cairo, the stone was brought to Cairo by the French, and apparently many people run to the harbor to see this marvelous stone. As we know, the French had to surrender to the British Egyptian forces, and as part of the terms of surrender, which are laid out in the Capitulation of Alexandria, which is a document that is currently kept in the National Archives here at Kew, and which we will also have in the exhibition, which I'm very excited about because it's a very historical document, as you can imagine. It was negotiated that 22 Egyptian antiquities would be handed over from the French to the British. But the French, with a lot of negotiation from the Egyptians, could keep their research materials. As you know, the Napoleon army also had a whole contingency of savants with him to document Egypt, the landscape, the antiquities, the people, the customs, and so on. And initially, the British also wanted to take those research materials, but the French protested, and there's a lot of famous quotes. One of them where they say, "We will throw them in the sea or burn our treasures." And you can count on the memory of history. You too will have burned a library in Alexandria. With negotiations, as I said, probably mainly by the Egyptians, the French were able to keep their research materials, which will lead to the famous Description de l'Égypte. And the British will take home 22 Egyptian artifacts, amongst which is the Rosetta Stone. This is laid out in Article 16. So what you see here on the right is what the French suggest, and on the left is what the combined forces, as they're called, which is, of course, the Ottomans and the British together, Ottomans, Egyptians, British together, because Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire at the time, is the kind of new version of it. And the document is signed by all parties, representatives of the French government, the British government, and the Egyptian government. It is then transported on the HMS Egyptienne, which was a frigate, the Egyptienne, also taken from the French. So it's a bit ironic to transport the Rosetta Stone on a French boat back to the UK, together with one other objects, and the other objects were on the HMS Madras. So they were on a different boat, and they arrived in Portsmouth in 1800. Are then temporarily stored in the Society of Antiquaries before they come to the British Museum. And I like to show this picture because it's just very beautiful watercolor, but also because you can see the British Museum being under construction. So what you see in the front is the gatehouse, and behind it's actually being demolished here. So what happens is these objects arrive, and it is a very important moment for the British Museum as a public institution, which was before a small collection housed in the Montague House, a very small, well, not very small, but a small building. And the arrival of these objects really encouraged the museum to expand and to become a big public institution in the same time as this is happening in other countries in Europe. And in the kind of background, you see the Townley Gallery being built. So they actually had to build a new gallery for all these objects, which is currently the Sculpture Gallery. Here you see a picture of, it's the mid-20th century, a bit earlier, 1930s, where you see the Rosetta Stone displayed in a very old version of the arrival of this group of objects was really a turning point for the British Museum to turn into a big museum, whereas before we could perhaps compare it with the Cabinet of Curiosities itself. So very important moments for the museum. What is the Rosetta Stone? In the second part of the talk, I would like to focus on the object itself and tell you a little bit more about the content. It's a priestly decree drawn up on the 27th of March, 196 BC. It was drawn up by a group of priests who gathered at the ancient capital of Memphis for this occasion, and they drew this up on behalf of King Ptolemy V Epiphanes, whom you see below. And of course, he was living in Alexandria at the time, and he came down for the occasion. The main text, which you see here 3 times, but the main part is lists the honors given to the king. These are introduced by a formula. It has been decided by the priests of all the temples in the country, and then follows a series of resolutions. The image of the king will be set up in every temple alongside that of the god, and this image will be worshipped like divine image. A statue of the king will be placed in all the temples and will be carried around in procession on festival days. The royal birthday and his date of taking the throne will be celebrated in temples every month with festivals and food offerings. The priests of all the gods will also add to their titles that they're also priests of the king, and so on and so forth. This is the core of the text. It's an explicit statement that the king should be treated like a god, basically. And this is an important point to remember because, as some of you may already been thinking, is not very Egyptian. The first part of the text, so this is more or less the middle part. In the first part of the text, we have a detailed motivation why the king deserved all these honors. He did a lot of good things for the country. Obviously, he protected it against invaders and rebels. He canceled debts to the throne. He lowered taxes, very popular, as you can imagine. He gave amnesty to prisoners and deserters. He guaranteed the traditional yearly allowances to the temples. He bestowed large gifts to the cult of the sacred animals. He repaired existing temples, built new ones, and so on and so forth. And because of that, and then the text follows that he should basically be treated like a god. As you can see, it's a very difficult text, even to look at. And I should have mentioned that when it was in the possession of the French and in the early years of British possession, a lot of efforts were made to copy the stone, and they did this using it as a printing block. And these copies were then distributed all over Europe. The decree ends by a statement of how it should be published. The first sentence, as you can see here, is that it should be written on a stele of hard stone. So that is a very nice indication to assume that this decree was, of course, not distributed on stone. It was probably distributed on something organic that was easy to distribute, to transport, probably papyrus, and then only locally was written on hard stone to be put up in the temple. In sacred writing, document writing, and Greek writing, of course, the sacred writing referring to hieroglyphs, which was the ancient script at the time. The hieroglyphic script used is quite old. I'll come back to that later if I have time. We can see that the scribes basically made an effort to make the text look old. Document writing, sorry, I want to stay with this for one more moment. Document writing, the native handwritten scripts used for daily purposes. This was basically the language and the script that people were using in the 2nd century BC when this stone was inscribed. And we have, I don't know why it's taking its own course. Greek writing, the script and the language of the administration. Greek was already introduced into Egypt by the 8th century BC, but in the time of, especially starting from Alexander the Great, it was really widespread and was used as the language for the administration. Importantly, this decree should be set up in all the temples of Egypt. If we believe this, then hundreds of stones like the Rosetta Stone should have been discovered. So whether this happened or not is unclear. Probably a lot of stones were indeed set up. 3 fragmentary copies, exact copies of the Rosetta Stone, have been found so far. One in Elephantine, all the way in the south of Egypt. One in Leontopolis, just north of Cairo, and a later one in Nubeira, which is a location very close to Naucratis in the Delta. These are copies of the so-called Memphis Decree, because the decree was issued in Memphis, and thereby are very close copies to the Rosetta Stone. But even this Memphis Decree is not an isolated text. We have this type of decree whereby Egyptian priests honoring Ptolemaic kings from Ptolemy III onwards. And this is only what we found so far, 28 of such decrees. First one in 243 BC, nearly a century after Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, and they continue to be used until the beginning of the 2nd century BC. The last one was, the most recent one dates to 182 BC. They're still being found. The last one was found in 2011, and most of them, of course, are still in Egypt, and actually the best preserved ones are in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. And of the Canopus Decree, for example, as you can see, which is one of the oldest ones, we have 6 copies. Next to the family tree, you see a map of Egypt, so you can see the distribution. So this is a result of negative evidence, and we can assume that most temples probably had such a stone. No examples are found after 182 BC. We don't know why that is. Perhaps by that time the royal cult was generally implemented in the temples, and the priestly families were fully integrated as part of the Ptolemaic state. So perhaps there was no need anymore to organize assemblies where the priest voted in honors for the royal family. I'd like to say a word on provenance and authorship. As I already mentioned, it's not a very Egyptian text. A decree in which Egyptian priests give divine honors to the pharaoh, because the Ptolemaic kings wanted to be seen as a pharaoh, is not very Egyptian. The pharaoh in the pharaonic period would be the intermediary between the divine world and the human world, and didn't need to be confirmed as such by his subjects. It was, however, very common in the Greek world and the Greek cities in Asia Minor and Greece for subjects to honor their leaders in this way. And so we can assume that the type of text came to Egypt with the Ptolemies and was introduced. They add to this very typical Greek type of text a veneer of local color, if you want, by translating the decree into Demotic and from Demotic into hieroglyphs. By that time, a bit of an artificial language that was, or an artificial script that was probably not used anymore outside very ceremonial context in temples. So the script would probably not have lent itself very well to the writing or the translation of a text that was probably conceived in the spoken language of the day. They also included an Egyptian motif, a kind of, on the top of the stela, which I will come back to in a moment. And they gave the king a pharaonic title here and there. And so we have to assume that because we are in the Ptolemaic period and Greek is the language of the administration, Egyptian priests were perfectly capable of writing Greek text and translating that into Egyptian. In fact, people working for the centralized administration would probably, regardless of the fact that they were Egyptian, would probably have been more fluent in Greek than Egyptian, and would perhaps have only spoken Egyptian at home. We do know actually that they were working in Greek and they were trained in Greek script and not so much in Egyptian. When they translated or when they composed the Greek text, they were, however, struggling or must have been struggling with some specific details for which no Greek words existed, such as specific architectural elements in the temple or certain names for shrines. And we see that they used words that are taken from the Demotic and then phonetically translated in Greek, but which would have sounded for native Greek speakers in mainland Greece would have sounded a bit funny. So the text must have sounded a bit funny for someone who doesn't know the Egyptian context. And then from that, probably the Demotic comes and only then the hieroglyphs, which are based on the Demotic. And as I said earlier, they made a very clear effort to make the text look old. One example I can give is the word for decree itself. As you can see, it's mentioned, the word decree in the last sentence. In Greek, it's psephisma, or resolution, decree, and they translate this into Demotic uch. And as we know, there is an uch in ancient Egyptian for this word, but they decide not to use that. They decide to use the word sechau, which is something like memorandum. So they on purpose don't use the closest ancient Egyptian word to the Demotic, but they use a synonym. And they must have had word lists or lists of synonyms from which they could choose for this work. You can see that we follow this reconstruction for those of you who have seen earlier reconstructions of the Rosetta Stone. This is a new one proposed by German scholars actually last year, and it's based on the Nubera stela. And I find the arguments of using this reconstruction rather than the older one that was used until last year quite convincing. The Nubera stela, although it dates to 182 BC, and is only written in hieroglyphs, is a very close parallel to the Rosetta Stone, to the text on the Rosetta Stone. And the reason why it's not dated to 196 BC is probably because it was recarved at a certain point, or the decree was reissued for whatever reason. But it's completely preserved, and it helps us reconstruct the part of the Rosetta Stone that is now lost. It was discovered in 1884, so also a long time ago, and it's currently kept in Cairo. If we follow this reconstruction, the original stone must have been 2 meters in original height. And as you can see, the hieroglyphic version would have been the longest as we would expect. Just a few words on the pediment, the top reconstruction. On the right, you see the Nobera stela, and on the left, the reconstruction that was proposed. You see the king, Ptolemy V, stabbing an enemy. On the Nubera stela, he is with his queen, because in 182, Ptolemy V was married to Cleopatra. In 196 BC, when the Rosetta Stone was carved, he was not yet married, so perhaps the queen was not depicted. There are other scholars who say the queen would have been depicted because it would have been standard to depict a king and a queen, even if he was not yet married. But yeah, they've left it like this for the moment. He is stabbing an enemy, which is an interesting reference to an event that is mentioned in the text, namely a successful or victory by the king of a rebellion in Lycopolis in the Delta. And Lycopolis is also the place where Shu would have conquered his enemies. And you can see it's probably not a coincidence that it's the god Shu who hands over the sword of victory to the king. And behind him is his queen, his wife, Tefnut. This is interesting that they depict this event because that shows us that first of all, the priest who wrote the text could probably choose what would be depicted in the pediment, but also it shows that what was depicted was probably inspired by the content of the text and less so by the place where the stela would have been set up or even carved. Interestingly, during the reign of Ptolemy V, there was a huge rebellion going on in Thebes, and this is not mentioned at all, perhaps because he was not yet successful, because in later stela it is mentioned. Shu and Tefnut are followed by 3 pairs of royal pairs, kings and queens. This is his successors and his predecessors, basically. Ptolemy the Fourth, the Third, and the Second. There was no place for Ptolemy the First and his queen. We don't know why they're actually more often absent, but it may just be reasons of space. So this is kind of a very Egyptian scene, and based on the Nobera stela, which is the kind of newly proposed reconstruction that we would also like to follow. Yes, I am going to end with giving you a little bit of a hint how the Rosetta Stone helped decipherment. It's from the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, it takes another 22 years. It is really a team work, we have to say, many scholars helping, building on previous work of classical scholars, of Arab medieval scholars and later Arab scholars. But the protagonists really are Champollion and Thomas Young. And I don't have time really to go into what they did, but I would just like to show how they used Rosetta Stone. They also used a lot of other objects, but that's for another lecture, I'm afraid. Champollion is, he strongly believed that Coptic would help, and they both differ very much in character, and they use different methods. They sometimes agree, they sometimes disagree. But what we can see is very different in the two is that Champollion felt that ancient Egypt really was the source for much that was celebrated in ancient Greek and ancient Roman art. And he had a huge respect for Egyptian art and architecture, and he found those superior to what was produced in the classical world. So to read the ancient scripts for him was a way to enter this really exciting world, which he dearly wanted to understand. And his idea or his obsession with learning the Coptic language also meant that he made a lot of friends among the Egyptian community in Paris. And so he really wanted to understand the ancient cultures that these people somehow indirectly represented. This was his opinion. You can see this by the quotes that I give, the very different approach. Thomas Young, as many people of his day, he was more of a polymath and did hieroglyphs a little bit as a kind of in his leisurely hours, just as a bit of a game. But for him, it was not so much about understanding the culture behind hieroglyphs. In fact, he didn't think that Coptic would help. He didn't think that the ancient Egyptians would have been capable of constructing or developing a writing system that represented spoken language. And this shows his disdain for ancient Egypt, which was very much, he was very much a product of his time. He thought Egyptian culture was vastly inferior to the Greek, and so was the writing system inferior to any alphabetic writing. I'm going to, almost end with this one. I have a few more slides, but I'll go through them quickly to have time for questions. The way they used the Rosetta Stone was also very different. I always try to stress that none of them really deciphered the Rosetta Stone. They kind of used the text, and it was really the titles, some phrases, some words, but mainly the royal names, of course, that led both of them to the decipherment. Thomas Young was very much focused on the demotic, whereas Champollion was more interested in the hieratic, but also worked on the demotic, as you can see on the left. So these are two manuscripts, on the left, the one of Champollion, on the right, the one by Thomas Young, that are kept in the National Libraries of France. So on the left, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, on the right, the British Library here in London. They looked for words that appeared often in the Greek text, and then try to locate purely spatially in the demotic text in the first instance, but also in hieroglyphs. They tried to find the same combinations of signs that looked similar in the same places as where these Greek words would appear. And in this way, they made word lists. And as you can see, they try to divide the text into different segments. So for Young, it was very much focusing on the Greek and using the spatial methods, which he found quite successful, and it helped him to really produce long lists of words. And building on the alphabet of Eukenblad, he improves this alphabet. Whereas, as you see on the left, Champollion really uses the vocabulary of Coptic to try to understand the sounds behind Demotic. He almost gave up because he finds the Rosetta Stone so incredibly difficult. He looks at papyri, and this is one of the early Dunant papyri that he looks at, and he compares the script with Demotic. And of course, this is another failure because it's not Demotic, it's hieratic, but he didn't really recognize how these different scripts, in his early years, we're here very early on in his work, he didn't recognize how these scripts would relate to each other. And again, a very nice quote that he almost gave up and said, I'm only going to study Coptic. And he was obsessed learning Coptic as well as, he said he wanted his Coptic to be as good as French, as you see in this very beautiful quote. The big breakthrough is, and I'm really jumping ahead here, but just because it's based on the Rosetta Stone, was the reading of Greek and Roman for foreign names. At this point, both still believing that only in foreign names, the Egyptians would use phonetic spelling. As you can see on the top, Thomas Young reads Ptolemy in syllables. So he says every sign is a syllable, whereas Champollion compares the cartouche of Ptolemy with Cleopatra, which is not on the Rosetta Stone, but he uses other sources for this. For example, the King's Lacy obelisk and the Cassati papyrus. And he notices that both names share 4 signs. And he says, therefore, the lion sign, for example, cannot be Ole or Old, but must be alphabetic. So on the basis of that, he really constructs quite an accurate alphabet. And then, of course, the very important step he makes is reading, this is what he presents in his letter, the Lettre à Monsieur Dacier, which is what we're celebrating this year. We only have a copy, unfortunately. But his real breakthrough then is that he says, if the writing system was able to produce phonetic writing in the Greco-Roman period, it must have been there from the beginning, because the Egyptian writing system must have been quite conservative. They wouldn't have allowed such a big change in their script. And with some of the letters that he had already read, he reads the name of Ramesses, Ra, Mes, SS. He reads the middle sign as M, which we now know is Mes, based on a drawing provided by Huyot, probably from the Abu Simbel temple. And then the discoveries come very quickly. As I said, he still also struggled with a lack of resources. And as you can see, he moves away from the Rosetta Stone very quickly, trying to read as many sources as possible. He makes a trip to Italy and a trip to where the Trovetti, Turin in particular, where the Trovetti collection is being unpacked. And Champollion was really the first one since antiquity who was probably able to read the royal name. So this was very exciting. He also finds there, of course, the papyrus, the King's List, the Turin royal list. And this allows him to reconstruct the history. And he had already seen, so he compares this with a drawing that he had already seen from the Abydos King List, which we will also display, which he sees in situ when he goes to Egypt in 1828. And this is a very important moment in the decipherment, Rosetta Stone, because here is really where he reconstructs Egypt and where we can see the impact of decipherment. So he did not only decipher a hieroglyphic writing system, he reconstructed the entire Egyptian chronology and went back further and further in time, and of course gets into conflict with the church. But on the 1st of January 1829, Champollion proclaimed that there was nothing further to add to his alphabet, as it could be successfully applied to all of the monuments in Egypt. We now know, of course, that the work was not finished in 1822. We're still on a daily basis, some of us struggling with ancient Egyptian texts, but it was a starting point of a long journey, or at least a crucial moment in the journey to understanding ancient Egypt. Champollion was the first, really, in my opinion, and I think many will agree with me, to really grasp the structural logic of the ancient Egyptian language in its varied forms. He did not just read or identify individual signs correctly. He did not just make important statements regarding the structure of the script, but he really gave us the tools that we need for exploring ancient Egyptian texts, the tools that allow us to actually read the text from A to Z. And that is really what decipherment is. Champollion spent his last few years exploring it, translating inscriptions until his death, early, unfortunately, age 41 in 1832. But the vista of discovery that he opened was absolutely staggering. And we hope that you all come to see the rest of the story in our exhibition. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elona Rogolski. I think on behalf of our audience here in the Zoom room and our audience in the future on YouTube, I just want to say thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. I think such a clear summary of the history behind decoding Egyptian hieroglyphs, and very interesting to really focus upon the text on that Rosetta Stone, which is, as you said, so often overlooked in preference for the decipherment itself. So thank you so much. Please do go and visit the exhibition that will be opening on the 13th of October. I will put links in the chat or in the description box on YouTube. Please do support it, go see it, see the full story, and please consider supporting the EES as well. Without your support and contributions, we couldn't put on events such as this. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you so much, Elona.
Thank you everyone for joining.